So you're interested in berserkers, huh? The frenzied, raging, unstoppable fighting machines. At least that's the romanticized popular image. If you're looking for very simple black and white answers, you're probably not going to enjoy this video. The reality is just too complex for simple stereotypes. And I'm not an expert personally, but I researched the work of somebody who is for this, and I'm going to show you what I found. And there's been a lot of debate and disagreement, and this is going to be a little complicated. The descriptions of the Icelandic poet and historian Snorri Sturluson from the early 13th century are pretty much in line with our modern conception of the berserker. He describes them as fearless, frenzied warriors, howling and shield biting, and invulnerable, apparently, to common weapons. They just keep going on, keep fighting, nothing can drop them. That sort of thing. There are certain problems with Snorri in particular. This was written 200 years after the end of the Viking Age. And of course, during and after Christianization, there was an effort to suppress and erase pagan traditions and folk myths. During Snorri's time, the Christianization was complete, and so it was no longer a taboo topic. At that time, it was considered safe to write about pagan history without automatically being accused of being a pagan. But either way, there were basically interruptions in the tradition, and there are a number of problems. I'll come back to that later. So that's pretty close to the current image of the berserker. In role-playing games, for example, they often get a boost to strength, additional attacks, inability to use defensive actions during the berserker rage. Sometimes they have the ability to go into negative HP, so at a point where another fighter would just drop, they keep going. They may drop dead afterwards, but they just basically don't feel the effects of injuries at the time, and they're also usually prone to attack anyone, including allies, in this kind of blind rage where they just lash out and just furiously strike until nothing moves anymore, or hopefully somebody else can calm them down. So basically a berserker is someone who disdainfully casts aside all protection and just rushes into the fray, oblivious of danger. That may sound heroic, but not particularly smart, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to do that on the internet, would you? The equivalent of just rushing in with nothing but a weapon would be like connecting to the internet with zero security measures, not even Windows Firewall. But fortunately, protection can be layered. Like installing a good firewall, for example, would be like picking up a shield, while installing an antivirus program would be like putting on padded armor. And installing a VPN on top of that would be like wearing rigid armor on top, like this brigandine with steel plates underneath. That is very safe. Does this make me look fat or something? Anyway, you get where this is going. This video is sponsored by NordVPN, which I switched to a while ago, and it's got a lot going for it. Thousands of fast servers in over 61 countries, and they keep expanding and updating. Military-grade encryption, no data logging, you can connect up to 6 devices simultaneously, and it's the only VPN that got full score rating from PCMag. Personally, I've been using a VPN for many years. It's just part of standard security measures for me. NordVPN is even easier to use than other VPNs I've tried, and they weren't exactly rocket science either. All you gotta do is install it, launch, go to the settings, make sure auto startup is on, kill switch if you want it, enable auto connect, set country, automatically pick best region, and done. Going online without security is kind of like sending a single unarmed psychotic berserker on a delivery mission with your valuables. In case of a hacker ambush, the chances of survival are not very good. Whereas using a VPN is more like equipping an experienced warrior with weapons and armor, that would be the encryption, and sending him on a hidden winding path through the woods. Definitely makes for safer delivery. So the link is in the video description down below. Go to nordvpn.com/SkallagrimYT to get 75% off a 3-year plan. And there's also the code SkallagrimYT, all one word, for a free extra month. In 1784, a Swedish theologian hypothesized that the Berserker rage was caused by mushrooms, particularly the fly agaric, and he was leaning on reports about Siberian shamans. He never actually saw the practice in person. And it raises some questions and doubts because aside from the poisonous effect of the fly agaric, it would cause really bad nausea, which is not really great for fighting. And also, the effects are not really a stimulant. There are several types of mushrooms that can cause hallucinations. But if you're tripping balls and seeing all kinds of things, that's again not great for fighting, because then you might be reacting to things that aren't even there, as opposed to focusing your mental faculties on the actual combat. And there are also literary references to spontaneously going berserk during times of stress or physical exertion. So it seems that they didn't always prepare with whatever substances to get into that state. Most of my research for this video is based on a PhD thesis by Roderick, Thomas Duncan Dale at the University of Nottingham in 2014, titled Berserkir or Berserkir, a re-examination of the phenomenon in literature and life. So there are several different sources that he goes into. First off, Viking Age archaeology. That's a limited source because whenever we find imagery, we don't know for sure what that depicts because there is no explanation, of course. So there's no direct link between the preserved images and descriptions of berserkers in the written sources. In the Torslunda plates from the 6th and 7th century, there is a warrior depicted which is either wolf-headed or wearing a wolf skin. And the sagas mention Ulfhednar, which is wolf skins. It seems very likely that they're referring to the same, but you do have to keep in mind that there is 600 years between those images and the texts. So it could be the same thing, could be something else. Hard to say for sure. Then in the Vatnsdæla saga, it says, quote, those berserkers who were called Ulfhednar. So the author interprets that as this being a subcategory of berserkers, but as far as I'm concerned, it seems likely that this could also be a synonym. So that these berserkers who were also called Ulfhednar, could be different, could be subcategories, could be the same. See, I told you this is going to be complicated. As far as the etymology of the word berserker is concerned, there are two main interpretations. It can either derive from the word for bare, as in bare chest, so not necessarily naked, but not wearing armor, or it can refer to wearing a bear skin. It could also possibly be both, maybe regional variation. But of course the imagery is open to interpretation and the link to berserkers is speculative. So whenever somebody is trying to tell you with authority that berserkers were this, did that, etc., without pointing out the uncertainties, be careful. Okay, so about the written sources. These are from medieval Norway and Iceland between 1100 and 1399. And the potentially most accurate ones are the Skaldic verses. These are attributed to specific Viking Age poets, and so they are easier to date. Like, for example, 9th century, this and that poet. Snorri considers the Skaldic verses to be accurate because he points out that the audience at the time would have known about the events that the Skaldic poetry describes. Like, for example, if it talks about the feats of King such and such, and it's completely removed from anything that happened, considering again the limitations of oral tradition, of course, at the time. But if they completely departed from what happened, people would have known at the time. And there's also the argument that the specific traditional form and structure of Skaldic poetry would make it difficult to alter without turning it into nonsense. They had very specific phrases like kenningar, for example, which are basically poetic code, a metaphorical word or phrase used for something like, for example, instead of sword, they could say shield wolf, or a spear is the bane of the Bernie, or something like that. However, even here it's not that simple. There is evidence of alteration and corruption for skaldic verses as well. It's just what's prone to happen both in oral tradition, think of Game of Telephone, basically, and also, copying and recopying, things like that. And also sometimes you only have parts of a poem quoted, not the entire poem, so the greater context is lost. Apparently the earliest written reference to berserkers is from the Haraldskvæði, which describes a late 9th century battle, but it doesn't tell us a whole lot because it just mentions that the berserkers were shouting and waving in battle. Oh, so specific. No other warrior has ever done that in history, right? Okay, what about the act of going berserk? Berserksgangur. Gangur actually means walking or motion or movement. So it basically means the way the berserker moves, not necessarily frenzy. In fact, in the word itself, there's really nothing about frenzy as such. In the Egil Saga, chapter 64, it says, "Then the Berserksgangur came over him, and he began to howl horribly and to bite his shield." Now, this could be a ritualized way of making yourself ready for battle, more than the symptoms of battle rage. So the question here basically is, what comes first? Do they enter the state of rage, which causes them to howl and bite their shields and whatever, if that's what they really did? Or do they do that in order to enter that state? It seems plausible that it may be the latter, because in Gretti's saga, a berserker is described who started to howl and bite his shield while he was still mounted on his horse, and then Grettir manages to surprise him and attack him before he was ready. So he started the behavior, going berserk, before he was ready, before he entered that state, basically. And of course, psyching yourself up in anticipation of a dangerous, stressful, or physically demanding activity is a very common human thing. You see that all the time. Athletes do it. Powerlifters, before trying to break a record, they will hype themselves up. Some of them will shout. MMA fighters will just ask their coach to slap them in the face, or slap themselves in the face, or some will jump up and down. Or there's a number of things that people do to bring themselves into this heightened state, triggering adrenaline and just getting pumped up and getting the body ready for action to perform at peak efficiency, basically. And they could also have done it for the morale effect in battle, or rather before battle, both to encourage their allies and to frighten the enemies. So similar to banging swords on shields or chanting before battle, that could have an emotional, psychological impact. On the other hand, in the Vatnsdæla saga, chapter 37, a man named Thorir mentions that the Berserksgangur comes over me even when I least want it. So it can happen without preparation, apparently. And again, as a reminder, when we're dealing with written sources, this is post-Viking Age material, and there's always some uncertainty and some questions about the reliability. We can also draw parallels to the Germanic tradition of animal masks and possible totemic animal relations. It's also possible that there were initiation rites, maybe involving killing certain totem animals and wearing their pelts. This could have to do with the rite of passage involved in earning the status as a warrior. This is also supported by Gretti's saga, where Grettir fights a bear, an undead monster, and a troop of berserkers to prove himself and be accepted. Sometimes those cults that you have to be initiated into through a rite of passage can be sort of at the fringes of society, but in this case, the berserkers also had a prestigious role as the king's elite bodyguard. So overall, Dell in his thesis concludes that the uncontrollable rage aspect seems unlikely to him. So he interprets berserkers as really more a professional warrior elite that prepared itself for battle. They may have worn animal skins with or without armor, hard to say. Archaeologists have also found that burials with images of Athena, so wolfskin warriors, are generally among the richest graves, so we definitely have some kind of elite. Dale even suggests that the word champion may be more appropriate than what we generally associate with berserker. You know, this kind of uncontrollable, raging, crazy, just force of nature, pretty much. And if you think about it, berserkers, when they're described, generally carry shields, so it's not this sort of throw everything protective away, just grab two axes and just charge in the middle of it. Viking Age warfare was generally not conducive to warriors running wild. They had formations, they had battlefield tactics. Of course, courage and boldness was highly valued, but professionals are simply more useful on the battlefield. If you think about the danger to your own troops that having just some warriors go crazy would pose, especially if they go into the full rage mode where they can't even distinguish friend from foe anymore and just lash out at anything. It would disrupt your formation. It would cause casualties, like the Viking Age equivalent of friendly fire, basically. And they would also fail to follow orders and adhere to battlefield strategies. It would just be a chaotic mess. And even if you would just like, yeah, okay, let them do their thing, and just this small group of berserkers just breaks out of your formation and just charges across the battlefield and throws themselves at the enemy, who maintain a formation and some degree of order, they would just be cut down. They would just be, you know, useless sword fodder, essentially. On the other hand, the deliberate act of going through certain maybe ritualized actions to hype themselves up, prepare for battle, and be more efficient, you know, get the adrenaline pumping, deal with any nervousness or anxiety, that will scare them and encourage us. Makes a lot of sense. How is that different to what other Viking warriors probably did to prepare themselves for battle? The specifics, I'm assuming, because it is very common to hype yourself up, you know, chanting, weapon clanging, all of that. It just seems likely that the berserkers had a specific set of ritualized actions that others recognized as, that's what this specific group of warriors does, going berserk, berserksganger. And of course, multiple interpretations could be accurate. You could have the deliberate method. You could have some people who simply snap. You know, you still have cases of people, for example, they report being in a self-defense situation and they report blacking out. Like in one moment somebody comes at them, the next moment all they know, all they remember is being on the ground, pounding at them aggressively. And maybe ritualized actions helped some warriors control their impulses and their blind rage and kind of channel it and make it more efficient. You could speculate about that for hours, basically. Dealing with an opponent who has no sense of self-preservation is difficult and dangerous, for sure. It's just not really a great strategy to deliberately do, either in a duel or on a field. So I hope you found this interesting and entertaining. Again, keep in mind that the sources are difficult, incomplete, open to interpretation, and we don't really know that much. In short, we know quite little, actually. But anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks, and stay calm.